Well, good evening, and thank you for joining us to celebrate the induction of Pearl Cleage into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. I'm Toby Graham, University Librarian and Associate Provost at the University of Georgia. And the university established the Georgia Writers Hall in 2000 to recognize the talent of our state's writers and to promote Georgia's literary legacy. I invite you to learn more about the more than 70 inductees, including Pearl Cleage, at georgiawritershalloffame.org. UGA's Hargret Rare Book and Manuscript Library administers the hall, a library that holds the most extensive collection of works written by Georgians and about Georgia, and the papers of many of our state's great literary figures. We rely on a distinguished panel of judges to determine which authors are inducted, and our judges include previous inductees, scholars, publishers, librarians, and readers from around our state. For those of us of our panel who are with us tonight, thank you for being with us and for your service. Our event tonight is held as a part of the University of Georgia's annual Spotlight on the Arts Festival that's happening in person here in Athens and also happening online throughout November. And now it's my privilege to introduce you to Valerie Boyd, who will help us to induct Pearl Cleage into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. Valerie Boyd is the Charlayne Hunter-Gault Distinguished Writer in Residence and Associate Professor in the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication at UGA. She founded and directs UGA's innovative low residency MFA program in narrative nonfiction. And importantly for this evening, she's also a member of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame Board of Judges. Professor Boyd was formerly the arts editor for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She's the author of Wrapped in Rainbows, the definitive biography of Zora Neale Hurston, and she edited the journals of Alice Walker that are forthcoming this April. Valerie, on behalf of the UGA libraries, please accept our welcome and our thanks for being with us, and the virtual podium is yours.
Thanks so much, Toby. Thank you. I am delighted to be here tonight to help to induct and welcome Pearl Cleage into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. Those of you who are joining us, I want to thank you for joining us for this wonderful occasion. And I know that for you, Pearl needs no introduction, really. You know her as an accomplished writer in multiple genres. She is an award-winning playwright, acclaimed novelist, essayist, and poet. And we are here tonight to celebrate her much-deserved induction into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. Congratulations, Pearl, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a real honor. I appreciate it.
Yeah. You are a Georgia writer, you're an Atlanta writer, but you are from Detroit. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, you're so synonymous with Atlanta. I don't know how many people know that you're actually from Detroit, but you've been in Atlanta most of your writing life, your adult writing life, and many of your works are set in Atlanta. And I'm going to come back to that setting in a minute, but first I just wanted you to say a little bit about what it means to you to be inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, and particularly at this moment when, with Georgia recently turning blue and with one of Georgia's most high-profile citizens being Stacey Abrams. Tell me what it's like for you to be inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame right now.
It's really wonderful. It took me a while because I did grow up in Detroit. It took me a while to think of myself as a Southern writer. And all four of my grandparents are Southern people from the South, but they all came north to Detroit. And we didn't do much traveling back and forth. So that the whole idea of moving south kind of took my grandparents by surprise. The fact that I was not only moving south, but I was moving to the deep South. I was moving to Georgia. So that I kind of clung to that Detroit identity for a while. When I got here, and people from Atlanta are also kind of reluctant to say you're an Atlantan if you were not born here. So that it took me a while, and I think it took the town a while. But I think of myself now absolutely as a Georgia writer, as an Atlanta writer. I embrace what that means. I'm very aware of the power of storytelling, and that's such a Southern thing. And even though my grandparents moved north, they brought that storytelling with them, so that my family was big on talking about things, telling stories about family and just about place. So that it means a lot to me to be inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. Also because this is a deep South state. This used to be a slave state where we were not only not honored as writers, it was against the law to teach African-American people to read and write. It was a serious crime. So for me to be able to be a professional writer in a state where it used to be illegal for me to even know how to learn to read is just such a great joy to me and a real blessing. And I embrace it, and I'm glad that I'm here when the state went blue, and whatever color it decides to be as we move on. I hope that it continues to move in a progressive direction. And I love that Stacey Abrams, who you mentioned, was one of my writing students, so that I claim her not only as a wonderful Georgian, but as someone who was always a really good student.
And a good and accomplished writer, even as she's doing her amazing work in the world. It's
Absolutely
just incredible how she finds the time to do both.
And she always wanted to, she was a very practical writer. She wanted to learn how to write fiction so that she could write romance novels in order to support the political work that she was doing. And she came and said this to me on first or second day of class. And I thought that was such a wonderfully disciplined, forward-thinking move to make, that I said, I'll work with you. You know, whatever you're trying to do, I will try to help you do it. So it was lovely to see her move ahead with that.
Yeah, it's interesting how, those of us who grew up as, like for me, growing up in the South and wanting to be a writer, my parents demanded a certain practicality from that. It's like,
yes,
you're a little Black kid, okay, writer. I'm first generation college, so my parents were always supportive of my dreams, but they didn't understand them. So writer seemed like something that meant you couldn't pay your bills, and maybe
exactly.
So
that was also a northern thing. That's what my parents were like. You want to be a playwright? You want to be? What are you talking about?
Right.
But it was always. I never really was one who thought that as a writer I was going to make a lot of money. I never really went into writing because I thought I could really make great money at it. I always wanted to tell stories. Even as a little kid, I remember telling stories to my sister, who's only 2 years older than I am. But as a kid, about 2-3 years old, I remember telling stories to my sister, so that the idea of being a writer, being able to write these stories down, was something that I always intended to do. The idea of making a living at it was something that came much later and never was the most important thing. At the time that I was becoming an adult writer, I had a lot of different jobs. And one of them was I could type really fast, so that I was earning a living typing, doing secretarial work, all of that kind of thing, because what I wanted to do was write. And I didn't want to tie that to having to get paid for it. I wanted to write what I wanted to write. And then the great blessing of someone saying, well, we'd like to pay you to do that. That was really unexpected and amazing to me, because I was going to do it. And I felt like all I needed was a job that was going to take 8 hours a day. I wouldn't have to take it home with me, wouldn't have to worry about it, didn't have to worry about climbing a corporate ladder. I was going to do something I could do in 8 hours and then leave and do my real job, which was always going to be writing.
Mm-hmm. Isn't it interesting how we all had our little practical plans? For me, in 8th grade, when Monica Pearson came to speak at my school, it was her first year in Atlanta as an anchor woman on WSB. I learned that there was a job called a journalist where you could write and get paid for it every day. So it was kind of like, okay, that's my practical way out, right? So it's just like trying to make a living however we could, but being committed to being storytellers and really getting to shape the narrative, which is what we do as writers.
I think so too. And I grew up in a very political family, so that the work that I was doing was always very much tied to the movement, to the civil rights movement, to freedom struggle, to those things. And I had the great good fortune to come of age as a writer during the Black Arts movement, so that there were writers who were not that much older than I was coming through Detroit, speaking at my father's church, so that there was Nikki Giovanni and Sonia Sanchez and, just a lot of really wonderful writers who came through, who would talk to me about what they were doing. And what I saw was these people who were not much older than I was driving up, usually in these beat up cars, mostly Volkswagens. They would open up the trunk, take out their books, come into my dad's church, do a reading, sign the books, and then go on up to the next place where they were going to read. And I thought to myself, what a wonderful life. I want to do that. I want to be able to travel around from place to place and tell stories to people, read stories to people, later to do plays with people. But it was that idea that you could be an independent being going around to places where people wanted to hear these stories about themselves, wanted to hear someone who was going to talk about the lives they were living. And that's the kind of thing that I was writing, so that it never seemed like a goal that was not achievable to me, because I saw people doing it. So that being a writer was as real and as possible for me as being a teacher, being a nurse, being any of the other things that people would kind of try to point you toward, because they felt like that was going to be a better life for you, where they would be able to guarantee that you could pay your rent and feed yourself. And I always felt like, don't worry, I'm going to pay my rent and feed myself, and I'm going to write stories. So, don't worry about it. I got this.
Right, right. And the importance of seeing those models is, you can't overstate that. I mean, for me, you were one of those models when I was in high school and we would go to the Hungry Club Forum. Remember those?
Yes, I do. Right down there in the Mother Street Y. I sure do.
Yeah. You were the press secretary for Maynard Jackson, and I would see you there being dynamic and writing and, handling the press and everything. And I was, 12, 14 years old, and I would look at you and say, that's what I want to be. That's who I want to be.
That's great. I love that, because I do know what it meant to me to see people not that much older than I was who were actually writing, because then it doesn't become something strange and mysterious or something that's way out of reach. And you have to, be someone who is different than the real people that in order to do it. People have these very, romanticized ideas about writing. People are in a beach house and they're walking up and down the beach and thinking about their next story. And it's like, I don't know anybody who really lives that way to write like that, but I'm sure there are people who do it. But the kind of writing that I was doing was deeply rooted in the life that I was living and the place where I was, because I went from Detroit to Howard University and stayed there for 3 years. And then I came here and finished at Spelman. And it was interesting to me because I loved growing up in Detroit. My high school was like 2 blocks from Motown, so that, we spent a lot of time trying to walk by the Motown studios and hope the Temptations would come out, which they never did. But when I got here, it was a different kind of feeling. And there were so many movement people still here. I got here in 1969, so that I was meeting people who were engaged in the same kind of work that my father had spent his life doing. And I felt immediately like this was the place I was supposed to be. And it was kind of a strange feeling, because I hadn't expected to feel that way about Georgia. And then I realized rather quickly that Atlanta is Atlanta, and then there's Georgia, which is around Atlanta. And I'd stayed in Atlanta for a good year or so before I ever ventured out into the state of Georgia, which was a very different kind of place. But when I got to Atlanta, it was, that moment where something in you says, oh, this is where I'm supposed to be. And it was.
Mm-hmm. So many of your stories, of course, are set in Atlanta and have been for decades. And not just Atlanta, but Southwest Atlanta in particular, and your own neighborhood near the West End. So why is it important to you to write about this little corner of the world?
Because it's the part that I know best. When I first started to think, okay, I'm going to write about Atlanta. Atlanta is such a big place. And West End could not be more different than Buckhead, which couldn't be more different than Mechanicsville, which couldn't be more different than all of those are different neighborhoods with different everything. So that I didn't want to try to write about the whole town because I had decided that I wanted to try to write a novel, which I hadn't ever thought I would do, but I had a story that needed to be told that way. So that I really wanted to be able to write about a place where I felt comfortable, where I felt like I knew the people who lived here. I knew the rhythms of the language. I knew I knew everything about this neighborhood, so that when I started trying to write about West End, it was like writing about home because I've been here for such a long time and I love that neighborhood. And I always love the story of a woman came to me after I had published a novel that took place in West End. And she said, I really loved your book, but you got something wrong. And I said, oh, tell me, what is it? What did I get wrong? And she said, the Krispy Kreme is not where you put it. The Krispy Kreme is across from the MARTA station. And there had been a moment in the time since I wrote the book to when the book was published, when the Krispy Kreme moved from the MARTA station over to by the West End Mall. And I said, I explained that to her. And I said, okay, in the next book, I'm going to have it in the place where it's supposed to be. And I did. But it was such a wonderful feeling for me as a writer that someone in the neighborhood I was writing about cared enough about that story to try to gently correct me and say, you did get that wrong. It should be over here as opposed to over here. And I said, well, Hank Aaron moved it and he didn't tell me he was going to move it. So I didn't know until I had a chance to correct it. But that, I think, is a real pleasure of writing about the place where you live, that the people who read the books will tell you, that was a story that I know. That is like my grandmother. That's like my block. That's like the house I live in. And that's what I'm always trying to do, make people see themselves in the stories that I'm writing so that it won't be like something that's far removed from their lives, but something that could happen right next door.
Right, right. I want to invite the people who are listening in and joining us to put your questions in the chat. We will definitely save some time for them later in the discussion. So if you have questions that arise as we're talking, please feel free to put those in the chat and we will try to get to as many of them as we can later. So Pearl, we talked at the beginning about you being a writer in multiple genres. How does that work for you? Does a story come to you in a certain form or asked to be written in a specific genre? Because you write plays, you write novels, you write poems, you write essays. How do you decide the proper container for the story you want to tell?
Well, the easiest one to answer that is between fiction and theater, because the restrictions that you have in writing a play you can't get around it. People will not sit in a theater for 6 hours. We wish that they would, so we could talk on and on and on, but they don't. So that at the most, you've got probably 2 hours, counting intermission, to talk to people. In a novel, you can talk for much longer because the story can go much longer. Also, settings. In the theater, you can't really take someone around the world. In a novel, you can. You can put them anywhere. One chapter, they're here. The next chapter, they're there. On the stage, you're very much restricted by what you can do with that physical reality, with real people moving around to tell your story. So that if it's a bigger story than can be told in 2 hours on a stage, then it has to be another form. And that had to be a novel for me, because I had a story that I wanted to tell, and I knew that I couldn't fit it onto the stage. And I was determined to tell this story. And this was actually my first novel, What Looks Like Crazy on an Ordinary Day. And it was right at the moment when HIV/AIDS was really becoming a reality for people. And I had so many friends who were dying, so many friends who were in denial about what the danger was. And I wanted to write about that. I wanted to create a character that people could look at so that they could follow this character rather than being terrified of this disease. So they could start loving this woman and then realize that this was a challenge that she was facing. And I wanted it to be a love story with a happy ending. So that I had to really figure out how to do that in a form I had not tried before, because I had never written a novel, and how to do it in a way that was realistic, but also wasn't just grim. There were a lot of books that were just really trying to look at this moment, but they were sad and they were grim and they were just, everything was terrible and everybody dies at the end. And I didn't want that because a lot of people were living with HIV. And I wanted this to be a part of establishing that as a reality. So for me, that was really the first time I felt like, okay, I can use this form for a story that is bigger than one that can fit on the stage. But that being said, my favorite form is theater, because writing is a very solitary activity. There is a point where you have to stop sitting around the kitchen table with your friends, drinking wine and talking about how wonderful the story is going to be and how great the book is going to be. And you actually have to send them home and sit down and write it. And with theater, you do have to do that. You have those moments by yourself when you have to write the play. But once the play is done, you become a part of a group of people, a troupe of people who are all connected because they are committed to telling this story. And that's what makes theater so wonderful to me, that you get both. You get that alone time that you need as a writer to shape that story and make sure that you get it on the page. But then you also get all of that time when you're collaborating with other artists, with directors and designers and actors to try to bring that story to life. And a novel is never like that. You write it by yourself, people read it by themselves, and it, unless you go to a book club and everybody's talking, you don't really get to talk much to people about it. And poetry, I think, falls somewhere in the middle, that you can read a poem by yourself and have an absolutely satisfying experience. But it's always lovely to hear someone, either the poet or someone who can really read the poem, read it so that you are hearing it in addition to being able to see it on the page. So that I really love to be able to go from one form to the other, because it means if I get stuck in one, I can jump to another one and say, well, let me try it this way. Let me see if this story wants to be told this way.
So how do you feel your long history as a playwright impacted your approach as a novelist? Like, did you feel particularly comfortable with dialogue and other things that might stump some novelists, but you had experience because of your playwriting skills?
That was where I was the most comfortable, with dialogue. The part that was harder for me was all of those things were in a play. You can say, it's a summer afternoon in Harlem. It's 1930. These people are not really wealthy, and they live on 126th Street. And then the set designer and the costume designer and the actors have to make that happen. The lighting designer has to make it a beautiful summer afternoon. In a novel, when I first started writing What Looks Like Crazy, I was like, oh my God, I've got to be the writer, the actor, the designer. I have to be everybody. And that was challenging for me. So I leaned toward the dialogue where I was the most comfortable, so that I tried not to drive myself crazy by doing too much worrying about, okay, make the set correct, make the lighting correct, but just focus on this story. What are these people talking about? And then see if I could make a way to have all those other things come out of the story, which was challenging, but was really exciting to me, because it is that moment where you realize that writing a play and writing a novel are so different, because you have to be all of those things when you're writing the novel. You have to be able to do everybody's job. In the theater, you can always say, well, the lighting didn't look right, but not my job. The acting was terrible, not my job. As opposed to in a novel, it's all your job. If the lighting isn't right, if the dialogue isn't right, it's all you. So that there are different kinds of challenges, I think, that that make it exciting to see if you can translate the skills you've got in one into another form and see how that works.
Do you keep your projects separate in that way, or do you jump from one to the other? Like, might you be working on a novel and a play at the same time?
No, I would
Okay.
never do it. That would make me crazy. I could never do it. I have to pick one. And it's like at the beginning when I'm thinking about it, should it be this or should it be that? Then I can kind of say, well, if I made it a play, I could do this with it. Or if I made it a novel, I could do this with it. But I can't do two things at the same time, write two big things at the same time. I can't even really write two little things at the same time. I have to focus completely on one because it's almost like you have to become a part of that world.
Yeah.
And I can't really go from one to the other. I know people who do that, you know, who can say, okay, I'm working on this book, and if it's not going good, then I come over and start working on that one. But I can't do it. If something isn't working, I have to stop and fix it and figure out why. Why isn't it working? Why doesn't it sound the way you want it to sound? Why is this character not sounding like a real person? What do they need in order to be real? And what is the story that you're trying to tell? You know, what is it that's at stake? Because that's always the question. You know, what's at stake? Who wants something really, really, really badly? And how far are they prepared to go to get it? And that's true on the stage. That's true in fiction, you know, where you've got to establish that there's something at stake. Otherwise, you have the terrible dread moment when the people are just talking. Characters are just on the stage talking, they're just on the page talking, but it's not going anywhere. And I always have to know, where is it going? And I have very good friends who are wonderful writers who start at page one and just start writing. And they figure it will evolve and present itself to them. I can't do that. That would make me crazy because I don't understand how you can know what's on page one if you don't know what's on page 300. Because page one for me has to lead me in a straight line to page 300. If it's a novel, to the second, into the second act, if it's a play. But it has to be something that I know, even if you don't want the audience to be able to guess. You as the writer, me as the writer, I have to know, where's it going? Because then I know what to leave in, what to take out. I know what the conversations mean. Otherwise, the people, you know, will just talk. And since I like writing dialogue, that's, you know, that's a real danger, that the people are just talking because I like to hear them talk. Once I get to know who they are, it's like, okay, what are they talking about today? And it's like, no, they have to be talking towards something, toward the end of something. And that's the discipline that I think is really critical to making it something that you're sharing with other people.
And you have to know that ending or that where it's going. You have to know that from the beginning.
I do.
So do you spend a lot of time thinking about that before you start writing?
I do a lot of character charts, actually. I answer all kinds of questions about these characters, who they are, how tall they are, all those basic things, but also what's their problem? You know, how's it going to get worse? How's it going to get better? Who doesn't want them to get what they want? So I do a lot of character work because for me, character is the most accessible part. Plot is very hard for me. I always have to find the characters and then figure out from those characters what the conflict is, because the plot is always much harder. But it's once you kind of figure it out, then it's lovely. Then I get to have fun with these people.
Yeah. There's a question from someone who's joined us. This person says, I'm always fascinated by process. Do you write every day? What is your routine?
I do write every day. I take Sunday off, but I write every day. And I try to get started somewhere between 10 and 11. During the pandemic, of course, everything, you know, schedules and all of that changed. But I try to start before noon, definitely, and then write till about 5. I used to be able to, not really be able to, but I used to write much later in the day. But that was because I had jobs, rent-paying jobs, where I had to be there till 5 o'clock. So then I would come home, do whatever I had to do in the evening, make sure my daughter was fed, do whatever I do in the evening, and then start writing. And that could be like 10, 11 o'clock at night before I started, and then write as long as I could, then go to sleep and get back up to go to work in the morning. But that's not my preferred mode. My preferred mode is to do about 5 hours a day, because I find that after that, my brain is tired. It's hard to write. You know, you have to really focus in such an intense way that you can't really write. I can't for 10 hours at a time. I can't do it. But what I do try to do is to stop before I'm out of something to say, not right to the end. Oh, I've got this great idea. It's going great. It's going great. I'll do another 2 hours. Because most of the time, after about 5 hours, if you go another 2, those last 2 hours are not going to produce great pages, not for me. Most of the time, if I keep going, when I start the next day, I'm like, what was this? This is a hot mess. I need to go back to where I was when I felt like I was tired and needed to stop. So now what I've learned is I stop at a moment when things are going great, not at a moment when I'm out of it and I don't know exactly who's doing what and what she would say and what he would say and all of that. Now I know that if I stop when everything is going really well and just make myself stop, and then I have the rest of that evening to think about it. What did you write about? What were they saying? And you stopped at a point where you want to get up in the morning and do it again. If you go further than that, so that you stopped when you're exhausted and you're confused, you really don't want to get up in the morning and do it. And you find yourself doing things that don't have anything to do with writing, you know, housework, laundry, things like that. Whenever I find myself doing stuff like that, it's like the writing isn't going well. So I have to make sure that I trick myself into sitting down every day and writing. But I try to do every day except Sunday.
Cool. How has the pandemic impacted your writing? I mean, for me, I feel like on one hand, I've become like just a hermit couch potato, but on the other hand, I've become quite productive because I have extra time. I'm not going out doing social things. How has the pandemic affected your writing, but also your kind of life as an artist in the world?
Well, since I'm primarily writing plays now, I'm in residence at the Alliance Theater in Atlanta. It was just terrible because you can't do theater by yourself. You can write a play by yourself, but you can't really do that play by yourself. So that all of that that I look forward to, rehearsals and going to places where they're doing the plays and being involved with the actors, being involved with the audience, all of those things were suddenly shut out. I had a play up in New York. They had to close it early because of the pandemic. I had productions scheduled for across the country, canceled all of them because the theaters were closed. There was nothing they could do. So that I really had to think to myself, okay, how do I manage to keep that energy that is theater all by myself? So I did a radio play for the Keene Company, which is an off-Broadway theater in New York. I started work on another play about 1973 in Atlanta, looking at the election, the first election of Maynard Jackson, because it's been almost 50 years, which I can't believe. But to try to keep working, but to know that the form that I was deeply invested in at that moment was not available to me. Just because of the pandemic, but to keep working and to find other ways to tell those stories. You know, I wrote several poems. I wrote a poem for the High Museum for an exhibition that they have coming up because I wanted to keep writing. I did not want to spend however long we were going to have to spend not writing. Not only because it would be wasted time, but I don't know what to do with myself if I'm not writing. You know, I have to write. You know, there's only so many Perry Mason reruns I can watch before I have to stop and do something else. So that I was very conscious of challenging myself. You know, people who asked me to do Zoom sessions, classes on Zoom, all of those things. I mean, I started off being a person who just hated Zoom. I hated the fact that the person you were talking to was not right there. But I knew that at this moment, I had to get used to it because if we were going to keep that dialogue going, keep that creativity going, we had to be able to use the technology that we had. So that we did. We did the youth program that I do with the theater. We actually did that on Zoom, which is so difficult to try to figure out how to get 20 young people that you don't even know well to work together and produce something that they're proud of and we're proud of on Zoom, but we figured out how to do it, because that was, I think, the challenge of the pandemic. How do you continue to do the work that defines your creative life in a way that you never thought you were going to have to? But I think it's good. I think it made us all dig a little deeper and figure out, what are you really trying to do and how can you do it?
Yeah, yeah, it definitely created new challenges for us. Do you think the pandemic fundamentally changed the way theater is going to be in the future?
I don't. I think that there will continue to be productions done outside, because people did a lot of really creative things outside. I'm trying to get the Theater, the Alliance, to do a piece that I wrote out in the piazza in the middle between the theater and the museum. That's a great space for something. So that I think that playwrights will continue to explore ways to do the work that they do, but to use all of those things that we were learning how to work with as the pandemic went on. But I think that it won't be the pandemic that changes what happens in theater. I think the biggest challenge now for theater is that people are so unused to having to go somewhere and sit down and listen to a story. They're used to this. They're used to the screen. They're used to being able to look on their phone and see a movie and all of those things. And theater requires a commitment to community. You have to come and sit in a place with a bunch of strangers in the dark and look toward the light and let those people tell you a story. But the good thing about that is that's a very ancient thing, to be able to sit in the dark, not in a circle most of the time anymore, but that's the campfire. That's ancient people sitting around a campfire telling the stories of our tribe. And I think of theater that way. So I think that we'll always do it, but we have to be able to figure out how we can relate to the technology, how we can use it, but not let us be overwhelmed by it, not have so many projections and films and all that going on that you lose the beauty of theater, which is at its most basic storytelling. Come into this space and listen to me tell you a story about you. And that's the beauty of it. So that sometimes I think we get caught up in too much stuff. We need too much lighting, we need too much set, we need too much this and that. And really stripping it down to the basics. What people want to know is, what's the story? Do I care about these people? Am I going to cry at the end? Am I going to laugh at the end? Do I care what happens to the people on the stage? And that doesn't have anything to do with how much you spent on the set. That has to do with how much the writer was able to make that story come forward in a real way. So I'm very conscious of that as a challenge that theater has. But I think people want it, because even if they don't go to the theater a lot, if they go see a really good play, they will have an experience that they'll remember, because you have it with other people. At the theater, you can turn to the person next to you who you may never have seen before, if the play is great, and say, wasn't that wonderful? And they'll say, yes, it was. And then you start talking. I always remember going to see Angels in America in New York. And I went by myself. I got a ticket at the last minute, and I was like in the third row, which was wonderful. And I was sitting next to a woman who it turned out was from Dallas. And she was engaged in the fashion industry, and she had on lots of jewelry and furs and all of that. But at the end of that play, when the angel comes through the ceiling, and it's just breathtaking, both of us, and we did not know each other at all, we turned to each other and we stood in front of that theater for about 20 minutes talking about that play. And I felt like I had known that woman all my life, because we had experienced something together that was much deeper even than we thought it was going to be. And we had to share it with another living human being. And theater is the place where you can do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That brings me to a question we've talked about before. I just feel like, as a writer, both of plays and fiction, but especially in relation to theater, like there's a kind of stealth messaging and stealth emotions embedded in your work. Like I always think, every time I see a play by you, I'm like, Pearl's so sneaky. Like, you take viewers by surprise. For instance, in your most recent play produced at the Alliance, Angry, Raucous, and Shamelessly Gorgeous, I told you this the other day, but I saw it and it felt very breezy and it was just delightful and I was just enjoying myself. And then all of a sudden at the end, I was weeping and I was like, what happened? Like, how did that happen? And I was trying to deconstruct, as a writer, I was trying to go back and deconstruct the sleight of hand that you had achieved that made me go from breezy laughter to heartfelt weeping and a different kind of connection with these characters, but also just what you said, wanting to turn to my neighbor, a stranger, and say, oh my God, did you see what just happened? Like, we're weeping. Why are we weeping? So tell me a little bit about, I know it's intentional, but how do you layer your work to achieve that? And is it different with a play versus a novel, for instance? Because you do it in your novels too.
I'm always trying to figure out a way to tell the story that will get the people who are reading or watching to the place where I want them to be without beating them over the head with it. There's so many bad plays where the point that the writer's trying to make is so obvious that there's no surprise, there's no joy in discovery, because it's like, oh, okay, he wants me to think this. She wants me to think this. He wants me to feel guilty about this. She wants me to feel happy about this, rather than trying to find the characters who can carry that story forward in a way where you're not making the point, they're showing you what the point is. And I'm always trying to do that because I want people to feel like, oh, this is great. I'm just walking through the story, and then to get smacked with something that's much more serious. Because I also feel like that's what life is like. Nobody comes up to you and says, now I'm going to tell you something profound. Something profound just happens. And you're there, and if you're awake and aware in the world, then you will notice it and you'll be taken by surprise by it. But it moves you in a way that it wouldn't if you could anticipate it, if you could guess it. And I think that's what I'm always trying to do. I love that you say that about my work, because that's what I'm always trying to do. It's like, okay, don't worry. It's just a little simple story, not going to be hard for you, not going to make you, have to challenge anything about yourself. And of course, that's not true. It's going to make you challenge everything about yourself. And it's going to make you think about things in a different way if I do it right. But it's back to what I was saying before about the characters. I have to come at it through the characters, because that's where my lessons come from in life, is listening to people talk. I'm the person who never is bored standing in line at the post office, because I want to hear the people talking. What are they talking about? Why are they angry? Why are they happy? What are they doing here? And I think that's the part that I like to work on. But it is challenging, because sometimes you want to just come to the point and tell people what it is. But you have to trust, I think, as a writer, that they'll get it. If you tell the story right, tell the story straight, they should get it. And if these characters are enough like real people that you care about them, when something happens, like at the end of Angry Raucous, where this woman has had a difficult time dealing with being older and she's not 25 anymore, and is there a place for her and all of that, and she discovers what she needs to discover, that she can give the gifts that she has to another generation of people in a way that's satisfying to her and to these younger artists. I think that if that kind of struggle, which that character was going through, is presented with all the humor that it really has in real life, because we're funny, even when we're doing things that we think are deadly serious. We humans are very funny because we take ourselves so seriously. We're so desperately serious about everything that we do. And most of the time when we relax and let it go, it's not only enjoyable to watch it, but you get the lesson much faster, much faster.
Yeah, yeah. A question from the audience. this person says, you know, you've noted that you've been telling stories and wanting to tell stories since you were very young. And they're asking if there are authors or playwrights who seem to be particularly important influences on either what you write or how you write.
I think the one that I would have to say is the person that I keep circling back to and have, you know, since I was very, very young, is Langston Hughes. Because my mother used to read us Langston Hughes when we were little children. Like other mothers would read fairy tales, my mother would be reading The Big Sea to us about Langston Hughes and about the rent parties in Harlem and about him going to sea and all of those things. So that I think that what I learned from that was a real appreciation for someone who could be honest about their own life, who could really tell you the stories of their own life and show you the moments where they made a big change. At the beginning of The Big Sea, which is the autobiography that my mother used to read to us from, Langston Hughes is going to sea for the first time, and he dumps all of his books into the water. And I remember when my mother read that scene, I was aghast, because if we dropped any kind of water on a book, it was like a capital crime. My mother loved books. But the idea that he needed to get rid of everything that he had been taught and find out who he was made me really understand something about writing, where you have to take in everything. You have to take in everything, but you also have to be able to throw all of that away. The other thing about Langston Hughes, I think that really sticks with me, is that he was able to make a real home in Harlem his whole life. But from there, he traveled all over the world. He went to places where nobody had ever seen an African-American person, where people didn't speak any English at all. And he felt deeply grounded in who he was because of the place where he had chosen to hang his hat. So I always felt like he was the one that I would keep coming back around to and coming back around to, probably because he was the first writer that I became aware of as a writer. This is what that means to be a writer. And then to be someone who was so deeply grounded in Detroit, in the neighborhood that I was in. It made me understand that I didn't have to go to Paris. I could think about Paris, but I could be in Detroit. I could be in the west side of Atlanta and still have all of those adventures without having to leave where I was and who I was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. Do you feel that the Black arts movement influenced you, and how do you see that movement influencing current social justice movements?
Oh, I think it influenced me tremendously. And I think I was very fortunate because I came of age at a time when there was a whole community nationally of Black writers who were very tied to social justice movements, to the movement, to the freedom struggle. And some of them were, nonviolent. Some of them were violent. Some of them were taking different approaches to the question. But that work was always a part of, how are we going to free the people? How are we going to tell the truth to the people? I mean, Mari Evans has that great poem about tell the truth to the people. And I think that that's part of what has always been so important to me about the Black arts movement, was that we were grounded in something. The other part of that was we were creating not only our own work, we were trying to build institutions. We were trying to start presses. We were trying to start magazines. We were trying to start theater companies. So that when I came of age as a playwright and graduated from college, there was a national network of easily 25 or 30 producing Black theaters from coast to coast. So that as a young Black playwright, I could send them my scripts and say, what do you think about doing this? And what do you think about this work? And how do you think I could fit into the work that you're doing? Those theaters, many of them, don't exist anymore. So that young Black playwrights who are looking for a place to find their audience, to develop their voice as African-American artists, they have a much more difficult task than I had, because they're going to theaters that might be culturally very different than where they're from. And I didn't have that problem. When I talk to young playwrights, young Black playwrights now, who may have graduated from Yale, They've never been in a class where it was all Black folks in there. They've never had an audience where it was all Black folks, where everybody gets the joke, because we've all had the joke. We are part of the joke so that we understand it and we can laugh together, which is very different than trying to see if you can get your work on the stage at a theater where most of the audience not only doesn't get the joke, but doesn't know when it's safe to laugh at what you're saying or not laugh at what you're saying. All of those things make it difficult for a playwright to find a voice. So that I'm protective of them, these young playwrights, in that way, because they are often being encouraged to lean in a direction that they would not be encouraged to lean if they could be in an audience where everybody in the audience shared the same cultural specificity. And that, I think, is something that's going to have a major lasting impact on African-American playwrights if they don't have a chance to work in front of African-American audiences. And many of the larger theaters in this country, large regional theaters like the Alliance, where I'm in residence, many of the audiences, the nights that you come to the theater to see your play as a Black playwright, and the audience will be easily 2/3 non-Black people, which is not a problem. Everybody can love every kind of work by every kind of person, but it does mean that you tend to over-explain things because you will think, okay, they won't get that. Let me over-explain it. Let me make sure they explain it, as opposed to, we all know this. I remember when I handed in the manuscript for What Looks Like Crazy, my editor in New York was a very nice woman, New Yorker, at a big white publisher. And I had said something in the piece, the main character is a hairdresser, and she said something about the kitchen. And my editor said to me, what is the kitchen? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, your character said, Black women will forgive you everything, but don't mess up their kitchen. And I said, that's the back of your hair, right here. So that if you pull it up, you want the kitchen to be fabulous. If it's showing, she had never heard it, never heard that expression at all. So that me having to explain that to her as a writer, then I have to be careful that I don't over-explain everything because I'm writing for her. I have to assume that if she's a careful reader, she's going to say, I don't know what that means. Let me find out what that means. In the same way that I would if I was reading a Chinese American book or an Indigenous American book, and I didn't understand something. I wouldn't expect that author to stop the flow of the narrative and explain it to me. I would want to go and find out what that is. But oftentimes, because of the racial history that we have in this country, there is a feeling that if it's a Black writer, you have to explain to someone who might be white reading the book or seeing the play. And I think that that's dangerous to the writer. And I think it underestimates the audience. I think if it's a good piece and there's something specific that they don't get, they will find out. They will find it. They will look for it. Or it won't be something that stops the flow of the play. Within the context of the book, the context of the play, you would find out what the kitchen was. You would know what it was because the story would make you know what it was. But if you're constantly writing for people who don't share your cultural heritage, then you may be in the position of over-explaining. So then the people who do share your cultural heritage are like, why is Pearl talking about that? She knows we all know this or that. So you have to really be careful about that line, which is why what I was saying about the Black arts movement was so important. We had Black presses, Black publishers. I mean, my first book was published by Broadside Press, Little Black Press in Detroit. All those theaters that did my plays, some of them were so small that they didn't have any money. They would say, I'm sorry, we would like to do it, but we can't pay you. We don't have any money. And I would say, well, you keep the lights on, right? Yeah. Well, you pay actors, right? Well, a little bit. So I said, okay, let's try to see how about you pay me like $10 and then send me a copy of the program that says you did the play. So it'll mean that you get in the habit as a theater of paying writers, and I then get to build a reputation for having had plays produced. And they were almost always open to that because they want to do new work. They wanted to do my work, but they thought they needed more to do it. And I said, no, what you need is a a stage and to tell me there's going to be some people there and we can figure out how to make that happen. And we did.
Mhm. So what's the difference now between the Black Lives Matter movement and the Black Arts movement, where it's like the Black Lives Matter movement and this so-called reckoning with race in America is leading to opportunities at those mainstream theaters where the producers and the audiences may not understand where the kitchen is, versus the Black Arts movement where we were creating our own things?
Well, it's a different idea, because if you're trying to beat on the door and say, let me in, I deserve to be here. You never,
Yeah.
as a Black writer, as a Black playwright, have to feel that way when you're at a Black theater. You know, you don't feel like you have to beat on the door and say, I have a right to be here. They know you have a right to be here because that's a culturally specific institution. So I think that in terms of the social justice movement and Black Lives Matter and the kinds of things that are coming out of that, I think the demands that are being made on the white American theatrical institutions, I think are really, really important. But it takes a lot away from the Black writer, because then you're not there as a playwright, you're there as a playwright and someone who's teaching them something. I'm doing the missionary work of showing you why you should do Black work. And it's like, you need to do American work. Let's make all of these American theaters. Then you can do American work. You don't have to say, we're only doing Black plays in February. We're only doing women's plays in March. We're only doing Indigenous plays in November. It's like, let's do good American plays. And let's make sure that the people whose eyes are on those plays, choose what plays get done, are a diverse group of people. You can't have a group that's only one group, that's the dominant group in a theater. And let's say in these theaters that we're talking about, often that has been an all-white room full of people, often all-white men in a room, deciding what's a good piece of theater and what's not. And what they think is important to tell, the stories that they're interested in telling, might be very different than the stories that I'm interested in telling. So we have to have everybody in that room. We have to change the decision-making point. Who is it who is choosing what we do? And then we can finally, I hope, get to the place where it's not, here's a Puerto Rican theater, here's a Black theater, here's a white theater. But let's say we're all American people and we're going to fuss and fight with each other. We're going to figure it out, but we are American people. Let's make American theaters. Let's tell American stories and not say in February, we're going to tell this and in January, this. Let's tell American stories 24/7 and let American people choose those stories. Then people will come to that theater, not only to see themselves, but to see other American people whose stories they're interested in. I love Sandra Cisneros. You know, she's not a Black American person, but I love The House on Mango Street. You know, I love Maxine Hong Kingston. She could not be further than she is from being a little Black girl from the west side of Detroit. But I love The Women Warrior, so that there are ways to tell stories where we all feel included. But that has to be something that we decide together. And even, you know, when we have these things about we see you white American theater and all of that has been going on, which is valuable and good and important, it puts us in the position of defying someone. You know, we demand that you do this. And that's not necessarily where you get your best work as an artist, in defiance. You know, that might not be the energy that brings forward the best story that you have. So that I'm thinking that this moment of demanding and beating on the doors is a transition period. And I hope that at the other end of it will be theaters that are much more grounded in being American theaters. Just at the time that I've been in residence at the Alliance, you know, we have a wonderful partnership with Spelman College, where bright young women who are studying theater there come and work with us, first as interns, then if they want to stay and we want them to stay, they can be fellows. We also have hired several people to work at the theater so that it becomes something that is a part of the theater's life. Not something where it's like, okay, we need some Black folks in this room. There's no Black people in here. Oh my goodness, there's no Navajo people in here. Oh my goodness, there's no, you know, this or that or the other. It's like, okay, let's make sure that everybody's in every room, on every stage, having their work published by every publisher. And I think that will happen because the country is changing. The country is becoming not so much one group or the other. You know, when you look at the demographics, we are becoming a very diverse country. And even though there are people who are really upset about that and frightened of that, and fear does not ever bring out our best impulses, but even though that's happening, that's a transition moment. And my hope is that on the other side of that, we will understand that all of our stories are basically the same thing. All we're ever talking about is love stories, war stories, family stories. Everybody tells the same stories. So that if we can ever get there, then we will understand it. And I think we as Black people in an audience or as readers, we understand that because we've always been required to do that. You know, I love Tennessee Williams. I love Ibsen. You know, they're not little Black girls from the west side of Detroit either. But I knew how to place myself as a reader in that story. And everybody can learn to do that. We just have to do it, you know, and we can. It's not difficult. Once you start doing it, you just find the flood of work that you can love that you had no idea you could love at all.
Thank you. On that beautiful note, I think I will turn it back over to Toby to take us out. And I just want to say thank you so much, Pearl, for this rich, full interview. I always love talking with you. I know we could go on for at least another hour, but I just want to thank you for this time and congratulate you again for being inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor. And I can truthfully say it never occurred to me in my wildest dreams that I would be in Georgia, first of all, and then be inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. So it's a wonderful gift to me. And I thank you, Valerie.
Thank you.
Well, Pearl, congratulations on your induction. We are so delighted to celebrate you, to celebrate your life, to celebrate your work as a part of the Writers Hall. It's a joyful moment for us here at UGA, and pleased to know that it's a special time for you as well. Thank you for all that you've shared with us tonight. It's been fascinating, engaging, enlightening, very enjoyable experience to hear you talk about your writing. To Valerie, thank you for your skillful and perceptive moderation of tonight's session, the wonderful rapport that you have with Pearl. I have no doubt that you all could continue on with a wonderful conversation, and the rest of us would hang on for much longer as well. And so many thanks, and no doubt, Valerie, you were the right person to do this tonight. So thank you. Thanks to the audience for the great questions, for being with us. And I'll just, I want to have a special greeting to Mary Frances Early. I see that she joined us, and Ms. Early desegregated our graduate school at the University of Georgia and became the first African-American graduate at the institution. So as always, Ms. Early, it's wonderful to have you with us, and we're grateful for you. And to all, please check out the full calendar of the UGA Spotlight on the Arts events that are happening in November. If you go to arts.uga.edu, you can find the complete rundown. So thanks again, Pearl, thank you, and congratulations again. And to everyone, good night.